During the summer of 2011, a few friends and I decided to go check out the supposed legend of the woods behind our town's public baseball diamond. Some people claim those woods were the entrance to hell. It was true that 2 girls were raped and killed back there during the 80s, but I wasn't sure I believed the rest of the stories, including hearing screams from the dead of night, reports of cloven tracks being found in the dirt, and snow always melting immediately upon the earth among the trees. Creepily enough, on the far side of the woods was a cemetery. At around midnight, 8 or 9 of us exited our cars and walked across the field towards the woods. We walked between the stands, what had been dubbed the gates of hell, and we entered the trees. Most of us stopped a few dozen feet into the woods, but my friends Malik and Peyton kept walking and disappeared deeper into the shadows. The rest of us just lingered there, talking way too loud and laughing way too frequently to try to mask the fact that we were all creeped out. Suddenly we all went silent as we heard what sounded like small children laughing only a few yards away. Not laughing like they were having fun on the playground, more like giggling, like they were being sneaky and spying on us. My friend Damien suddenly screamed, "Whoa, watch out!" and sprinted back out of the woods. Not even 30 seconds later, Malik and Peyton also came running out of the trees. The rest of us turned and followed them back out. Once we were all safely back on the field, Damien said that he had seen a figure emerge from behind a tree and head straight towards him. Peyton said that he and Malik had heard footsteps coming towards them and saw 2 glowing red eyes. All 3 of them were shaken badly and wanted to leave. I kind of smirked, half convinced they had just been imagining everything. But another part of me was legitimately spooked and wasn't about to walk into those woods. The madness didn't stop there, unfortunately. On our way home, Peyton started to complain about his back burning. I lifted his shirt and saw scratches all over his lower back, deep enough to draw blood. Everyone in the car started freaking out. Then Damien, who was driving, started gagging like he was throwing up. He pulled the car over and stumbled out of the car and collapsed on the grass. Peyton, Sarah, Jake, and I all got out as well and walked over to him. But the second car with the rest of my friends kept driving. Damien vomited a thick paste-like substance and then started cursing violently and shaking, yelling at all of us in a tone of voice that wasn't his own. I honestly don't remember most of what he said, but he was spewing profanity so fast that it made me want to get back in the car and lock myself in. Damien leapt up and physically tried to attack Sarah, but Jake and Peyton held him back. Jake punched him hard in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him, and he collapsed onto the grass. That's when Sarah started screaming. Back down the road in the direction we had just come from, the streetlights began to flicker, and we saw a single lone figure walking down in the middle of the street. The thing didn't seem to be moving its legs. It seemed to be gliding, like it was floating towards us. Sarah and I screamed and jumped back in the car. I got behind the wheel and put the car into drive. Jake and Peyton grabbed Damien and threw him in the back. The doors weren't even closed when I floored it and took off down the road, blowing right past a stop sign. I had seen the figure coming closer in the rearview mirror and had nearly lost my shit when I saw its glowing red eyes. We drove straight to the emergency room, left Damien, and scattered. Malik and the others in the second car were all involved in a serious car wreck that night that resulted in all of their deaths. Damien made a full recovery, physically, but was never quite the same mentally. He would complain for several years after that he heard voices in his head and would sometimes see figures coming for him out of the shadows. He eventually killed himself in 2015. Peyton joined the seminary and is studying to become a priest. The rest of us are still slightly shell-shocked about that night and consider ourselves incredibly lucky to be alive. So my mother told me this story years after it happened. My dad was a truck driver at the time he left the military in the early 70s. By the time my siblings and I were born, he only drove in our home state of Texas, and summers were extremely busy for him. This incident happened during the mid-80s on one of his extended trips across Texas. I believe he was driving south on 281. He was getting tired when he pulled his rig into the parking lot of a truck stop. He was making his way to the on-site convenience store when he noticed a young woman pacing back and forth in front of the shop. She looked to be in her early 20s, slim, very pretty, blonde, and wearing a tank top with cut-off shorts, normal attire for Texas summers. She was carrying what looked like a plate covered in aluminum foil, as if she was making her way home from a family barbecue. He finished his business in the store and headed back to his truck. As he got in, he was stunned to see that the blonde woman was now sitting in his passenger seat. He was utterly shocked. He had no clue who this woman was or how she got past his locked door. My dad was always very vigilant on the road and never left his truck unlocked. He demanded that she get out of his truck. He wasn't afraid at this point, but something felt off about this mysterious woman. She sat there and looked at him, with the covered plate on her lap, not saying a word. For a moment he wondered if he should just get out, walk over to the passenger side door, and just yank her out of the cab. But he decided against it. I'm still not sure why. The whole thing was beyond strange, so my dad, against his better judgment, turned his rig on and drives off, with the blonde woman still in his passenger seat. A few miles up the road, he attempts to make conversation. I guess he was trying to quell the extreme discomfort he felt. He asked her name, but again, the woman remained silent. As they continued down the highway, lustful thoughts began to creep into my dad's mind. I'm sure it had been a while since he had last seen my mother. Out there in the rural Texas roads, who would find out? Just this one time. What could happen, right? My dad puts his hand on her thigh, right above her knee. As soon as he touched her, the blonde woman turned from a gorgeous young woman into some kind of hellish monster. Her face turned rugged, and her eyes were now black pits. Her teeth had turned into sharp fangs with a long, unnatural-looking tongue. The demonic figure let out a guttural hiss. From the plate she was still holding came the sounds of slimy movements, as if there was a pile of writhing worms beneath the foil. A putrid smell permeated the truck's cab, and my dad quickly turned his face from her and managed to bring his rig to a stop on the side of the road. As the truck came to a halt, my dad opened his door and jumped out of his truck. After taking a few moments to compose himself and allow his breathing to return to normal, he looked back at his truck. The demonic woman had vanished. He was now alone on the road. He started to pray, asking for God to rebuke the evil spirit. He eventually got back into his truck and drove off. The woman did not return. However, it was a while before the lingering stench dissipated. When my dad got home from that trip, he recounted everything to my mother. He had been so scared that my mother would not forgive him for his unfaithful indiscretion. He had seen a lot in his life, but nothing had ever frightened him like that before. He blamed himself for having impure thoughts, and perhaps that's why he attracted the evil spirit. I know many might say that people cheat on their partners all the time, and nothing like this happens to them. I can't explain why. I only know what happened to my father on the dark, lonely roads of Texas. When I was older, I brought up this experience to him and asked, "Dad, did that really happen to you?" He would never respond with words and just nodded. I want to give some perspective to the setting. This occurred on the morning after Thanksgiving in 2016. I was 15 at the time. and I was staying at my dad's house for the holiday. I was sleeping on the top bunk of my bed. This particular bunk bed had stairs instead of a ladder. This is where my story begins. I began to stir in my bed and eventually I woke up. I was confused and I checked my phone for the time, as I usually did when I would wake up unexpectedly in the night. I saw that the time was 3:30 a.m. I chuckled to myself, seeing that it was the witching hour. But then my attention was brought to something else. I heard a sound. The best way I can describe it is meat being eaten off of a bone. My dad's house was going through some remodeling at the time, and most noises would tend to echo throughout the house. The sound was coming from within my room, more specifically in the corner of my room between the bookcase and TV. It sounded too close to be outside my window or out in the hall. I didn't have my TV on, nor was I listening to anything through my headphones. This sound was coming from the inky blackness in my room. The only thing I could hear was smacking lips and grotesque chewing. At this point, I was hiding under my blankets and rubbing my eyes to make sure I was fully awake. I have never experienced sleep paralysis in my life, and I've been able to distinguish vivid dreams from reality. I was clearly conscious. I was trying to make sense out of this situation the best I could, but I was having a hard time rationalizing this. The sound persisted, getting a bit louder. I grabbed a pair of needle-nose pliers that I used to make crafts earlier that day and was too lazy to put back. I had no idea what to do at this point. If I decided to use the bunk bed stairs to exit my room, I would have ended up right where the sound was coming from. And had I just jumped off the opposite side of the bed, which was closer to the door, I could have really hurt myself in the dark. I also wasn't planning on using the flashlight on my phone and run the risk of being attacked by the thing in my room. The thought came into my head that I should contact someone. I slipped my hand out from under the covers to grab my phone. Apparently, I had been listening to this horrifying noise for about 20 minutes. I was trying to figure out what the noise could possibly be, and the only thing that I could think of was my family being cannibalized. And I was next. I know that's a little extreme, but that's all my brain could come up with. I really couldn't tell you why I thought that was the case in this scenario, but the thought was on repeat inside my head. Hell, I wasn't even sure if what was making the sound was human or not. We did have an alarm system. Nothing had been tripped, so I was beyond confused. Now I was going to have to make a choice on who I should contact about this terrifying situation. At first, I was thinking about texting the people I cared about, like my mom, my partner at the time, my close friends, as I didn't know what was to come next. I was then heavily considering contacting the authorities, but I'm not a huge fan of the police, and I was concerned that if they arrived unexpectedly, my dad would be pissed if there turned out to be nobody in my room. I then realized that contacting my dad would be my best bet. That's if he was still alive. He kept at least 2 guns at his bedside at all times. I came to the conclusion that I should try to get his attention. I attempted to text him at first, as that was the stealthiest option. I typed out a paragraph explaining how I woke up, and thought that someone was in my room. I insisted that he get his gun. I listened closely to see if I could hear my dad's phone go off, or even if I could hear his usually loud snoring. I couldn't hear either. I assumed that his phone was on vibrate, so that meant that I had to call him and hoped that he answered. His phone rang a few times before he picked up. Hello? Check your phone, I whispered as quietly as I possibly could. What? Check your texts, I whispered a little louder before hanging up. The pressure in the room somehow managed to get even heavier as I hung up the phone. The sound grew louder and shifted closer to my bed. Recounting this next part still makes my skin crawl. I heard whatever this thing was brush past the vase on top of my bookshelf. The sound was shortly followed by the first step of my bunk staircase creaking. My heart sunk, and the blood in my veins ran cold. Suddenly, my bedroom light was switched on. I threw my blanket off to see my dad in the doorway, pistol in hand. The sound had instantly stopped, and there was nothing on the stairs. My dad looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. I bursted out into tears and shook violently. I thought I was going to be murdered in my own bedroom. My dad told me to come with him. I slowly got up and made my way onto the stairs. I peeked over into the small space between the stairs and the wall, which would have been the only place for a person to hide in my room. Luckily for me, there was no one there. I went into the living room with my dad. We had 2 couches. My Nana slept on one, and I was going to sleep on the other. My dad asked me what happened, and I explained everything to him as best I could. I was trying not to have a panic attack. He was very confused considering how early it was, and I was rambling on about how I thought there was a cannibal in my room. He made sure the alarm was on and said that he would take me to my mom's in the morning, as he didn't know what to make of the situation. I don't think that this was a hallucination or some kind of trick of the mind, because I've never experienced anything like that for half an hour straight. The only way that I can explain what happened was that I had a paranormal encounter. I believe in spirits, demons, and other things of that nature. Whatever that thing was gave off a very negative energy. That wasn't the first or last experience I had in that house, but I've never had anything that intense happen to me since. This is a true story. It happened in the mid-1970s when I was just a young girl. I was only 11 years old at that time. I lived with my parents, my younger sister, and 3 brothers. I'm not a very good storyteller, but I will tell it the way it happened. When I was just a young girl, my parents got together with my aunt and uncle to play cards, almost every Friday and Saturday night. Now, my sister and I would sleep in the bedroom just off the dining room, so we could see and hear the games as they were being played. Our bedroom had 2 doors, one that opened out into the kitchen, and the other led into the dining room. About my aunt and uncle. My aunt's mother practiced black magic and demon worship. My parents knew about this, but I found out later. One weekend, my aunt and uncle announced that they were expecting a baby. My sister and I were very excited, because we would be allowed to babysit when the adults were playing cards. We began counting down the days. In the meantime, my aunt's mother gave her yarn scraps so that she could sew a blanket for the new baby. This was where the problems began. The baby was finally born. She was a beautiful girl named Samara. I'm changing the names for obvious reasons. Whenever my aunt and uncle were at the house, my sister and I were glued to Samara. We absolutely loved babysitting. One night, after my aunt and uncle left the house, my sister and I were in bed. We had bunk beds, and I slept on the top. We began hearing scratching sounds inside the walls of our bedroom. We didn't think much about it at first, but it got worse. After a while, we started waking up with scratches on our arms and legs. A few times, I was awakened by scratches on my stomach and back, and they always burned like crazy. My parents had an exterminator out because they thought rats were in our room, but the scratching continued and only got worse as time went on, and then the knocking started. The knockings always came in threes as well, and it would happen all over our bedroom walls. About this time, we also noticed that our bedroom was becoming extremely cold. This was in the summer, and we had no AC in our room, so it was a bit odd that it would be so cold. It would get to the point where we could see our breath. About the time that the knocking started, we would also hear whispering in our room, along with another noise that I can only describe as raspy growling. It was around this time that my aunt started to exhibit odd behavior. She would randomly growl and make strange noises, She glared at my uncle and the baby. She was no longer the friendly and loving person we've always known. My aunt and I had been very close before, but she seemed to distance herself and was always rude and nasty. One night, I woke up to the sound of voices coming from the dining room, and I could see that the dining room light was on. Our bedroom door was slightly ajar. I got out of bed to see who was out there, but as soon as I opened the door all the way, I saw that all the lights were off, and there was no one there. On another night, I woke up and went to the kitchen to grab a drink of water when I heard whispering voices coming from the living room. There were no lights on, and it was pitch dark. When I turned the kitchen light on, the voices suddenly stopped, and there was no one there. This happened almost every night, and whenever I would check things out, there would always be no one there. One night, everyone woke up in the house to the sound of pounding at our front door. When my father opened the door, my uncle fell into his arms and was crying hysterically. The only thing we could make out was him saying, "She stabbed her! She stabbed her!" When my uncle finally calmed down, he told my parents that my aunt had stabbed the baby 6 times in the back. He said it took 6 police officers, 4 neighbors, and my uncle to subdue her. He claimed that she was throwing around the officers like rag dolls. My aunt is a very small woman, and under normal circumstances, she wouldn't have been able to lift a fully grown man, let alone throw him across the room. My aunt would eventually be admitted to a mental hospital. The baby was alive, although no one understood how. She was in intensive care for 2 months, but thankfully made a full recovery. The night after my aunt had gone insane, I woke up to a freezing cold bedroom. It was colder than it ever had been before. I heard whispering in our room. It was coming from the adjacent dining room. The bedroom door was open, and as I looked up, there was this dark mist. There was a man's face in the mist. He had black hair, a black mustache, and a goatee. His eyes were pure black, and he stared at me with the creepiest grin on his face. I was so terrified that I started screaming. My screaming woke up my sister, and she began screaming as well. This woke up the entire house. My parents and older brother ran into the room, and as soon as the light came on, the creepy face disappeared. My father grabbed me off the bed and carried me into the living room as my mother took my sister. When we were finally calm enough, I told my parents about the mist and about the creepy face. The next day, my mother and father started trying to figure out what had entered our home just before these weird things started happening. We searched the house, and the only thing new that had come into our house just before these weird things started to occur was the baby blanket that my aunt had made from the yarn that was given to her by her mother. My mother called my uncle, and he and my older brother decided to take the blanket out and burn it. They put the blanket in the trunk of my mother's car and drove out to the river. As they drove, the trunk of the car flew open. My brother got out and closed it. However, they didn't get far. The brakes in the car went out. My mother had just gotten new brakes put on the week before. So after the brakes went, they walked over to the bridge over the river, and my brother and uncle took the blanket, doused it with gasoline, lit it, and threw it off the bridge. As the blanket fell, my brother and uncle heard screaming. It wasn't just one voice screaming, but many. After the blanket was gone, our house started to feel normal again. It was warm and welcoming. There was no more whispering or knocking on the walls. We had no more scratches on our bodies. Unfortunately for my aunt, after she got out of the hospital, she became more distant, and my mother no longer associated with anyone who was involved with black magic or demon worship. My aunt and uncle divorced shortly after she was released from the hospital. And the craziest part of all is that my aunt was awarded custody of the baby who she had stabbed when she was only 6 months old. I have not had any contact with my aunt or Samara in many years, but I truly hope all is well with them. It's been over 20 years since these events have occurred. I was reluctant to share what happened to me because I didn't feel like arguing against doubt and disbelief, and defending my own sanity. In the late 1980s, I was a curious teen. I became fascinated with the occult. As a child growing up in a religious household, my first exposure of occult themes came from the Bible. I always strained to understand my beliefs concerning the teachings of the church, and especially struggled with my own faith in God. After learning that demons were former angels who had rebelled against God and were cast down to the earth and could interact with humans, I came to the conclusion that the best way to prove to myself that God existed was to see if demons existed. There was no internet back then to explore my questions and satisfy my curiosity. Knowledge of the occult was hard to come by and had to be searched for in libraries and bookstores. In time, I collected a small library of books about witchcraft and demonology. Looking back now, I realize how foolish I was. I didn't understand what I was getting myself into. Those books have since been destroyed after what eventually happened to me. I began reading those books and actively trying to invite demons into my life. I read out loud long strings of demonic names out of those books. I would cast spells and draw symbols on my wall and on the floor. Nothing ever happened. I had a few strange dreams, but that wasn't proof of anything. One day I came across a paragraph that told me to get a full clove of garlic and stake it with a large iron nail. This would attract demonic power to a certain place. I did this and put the staked clove deep in my closet. The demons did not come to me suddenly. They came gradually, insidiously working their way into my life and psyche, without me hardly noticing. I woke up more frequently from nightmares, sometimes listening intently, because I could have sworn that what had awoken me was laughter or whispering. I passed these off as dreams. Sometimes I woke up paralyzed for a few seconds. I dismissed this as sleep paralysis. I woke up sometimes with all my sheets on the floor, far from the bed. I awoke some nights thinking, was my bed just moving? And again I would pass this off as restless sleep. Then one night I woke up to watch my hand and arm shoot up from my side, grab the lamp on my night table, and throw it across the room with such force that I pulled my shoulder out of its socket, and the lamp practically exploded against the opposite wall. I sat in the dark, cradling my arm, wondering how I could do such a thing out of a dead sleep. A few nights later I did the same thing with a new lamp, with the same arm. I had to wear a sling to retract movement of the shoulder. A week later, it happened one more time. But I didn't grab the lamp. I tore the sling right off my neck. I thought all these occurrences were very strange, but I still proceeded to invite the demons. I was still not convinced. I was such a fool. I became irritable, and my family started to notice. My parents thought that I might be on drugs. I was brought to a psychologist who tested me, and I was diagnosed with depression. I told no one what I was up to. Over time, the odd occurrences only increased. Late one night, I awoke to the full moon shining on my face, through my bedroom window. I debated sharing this part because it sounds so strange, but I began growling at the moon. I remember not thinking as myself. My thoughts were basic and primal. I began growling more ferociously, until I was practically foaming at the mouth and snapping at the moon like some rabid animal. I eventually snapped out of my trance and started wondering what the hell I was doing. I didn't know yet, but at this point the demons were ready to pounce. They felt they had weakened me enough to extract my soul from my body. These next recollections are the most vivid in my mind. One night I awoke and felt very strange. I felt a jarring disjointedness. Then part of myself lifted out of my feet and then worked up my body until I was floating above the bed. It felt something like if you were to smoothly pull a piece of tape off a flat surface. I was floating above my bed, and I was looking down on myself. I tried to move, but I knew somehow that I would have had to learn how. After being amazed at what was happening, I then felt something grab me by the feet and then started to violently shake me like a rag doll. I felt like a streamer being whipped back and forth. Something was trying to tear me away from a connection that I still had with my body. I was terrified, and I knew that if whatever was doing this to me succeeded, I would die. But the cord, I don't know what else to call it, that was tying me to my body was too strong. They could not break it. They gave up and let go. I then floated lazily up to the ceiling. I remember my cheek resting slightly against the ceiling of my room. I set my eyes on a specific imperfection on the ceiling. I had studied it many times from below, but it was now a few inches away from my face. I remembered thinking how different it looked from up there. Suddenly I was back in bed, looking up at the ceiling where I just was. I was taking in deep breaths like I needed air. I still felt strange and was paralyzed with fear. I felt my chest getting heavy. I took in a deep breath, but the feeling stayed. Now I felt as if I was being pushed down, but I did not feel any pressure in a specific place. It was as if some invisible weight had been draped over my torso and was only getting heavier. I remember thinking that this was just a dream. There was no way that any of this was actually happening. Then I heard a loud sound that I will never forget. I heard the sound of my bed creaking. I was sinking into the bed, and the sound of the wood warping under the increased weight was real. In a frenzy of fear, I burst out of my bed and ran out of my room. I went to my sister's house, who lived next door, and I woke her up to let me in. I was wide-eyed and hyperventilating. She eventually calmed me down and began asking questions. I didn't tell her about what I had been doing and told her that I saw a ghost. She laughed it off and told me to stay the night if I wanted to. I stayed, but I did not sleep again that night. By the next day, I knew what I had to do. I went back to my house and up to my room. I quickly went to the closet, grabbed the clove of garlic with a staked nail, which was now rotten black. I took it outside. My parents' house is made of stone, and I found the largest open space of the wall that had no windows and threw the clove against the stone. I swear the thing exploded against the wall like I had thrown a grenade. There was nothing left. I threw all the occult materials, objects, and books I had into the wood stove and burned them. I cleaned the symbols off the walls and furniture, and I never slept in that room again. Nothing like what I have told you ever happened to me again. I think whatever demonic entity it was had their one chance, but failed, and they never bothered me again. So, do I now believe in God? I'm still not sure, but I do know that there are malicious entities in this world, and if you invite them into your life, they will gladly come in.
There's always a reason to be afraid.